The planet of Kelvora had always been quiet. Its people never believed strength had to be loud. They didn't build massive towers that scratched the sky or fleets of warships to show their power. Instead, they built gardens, riverside cities, and peaceful communities under a soft amber sun. 4 silver moons slowly circled their world, and for generations the Kelvori believed they were safe. For 2 centuries they had been members of the Galactic Sovereignty, the massive alliance that ruled most of the known galaxy. Hundreds of civilizations were part of it, powerful empires, advanced collectives, military federations, all bound by one promise. If any member was attacked, the others would respond. Or at least, that was the promise. Elder Sathrin had believed in that promise for most of his life. He was one of the oldest leaders on Kelvora. His green-scaled skin had faded with age, and his golden eyes carried the weight of decades spent serving his people. He had sat in council meetings, signed treaties, spoken with diplomats from worlds so distant they felt like legends. The sovereignty had always seemed unbreakable, until the day the Draxen Dominion arrived. The Draxen were not new enemies. For nearly a century they had been feared across the galaxy. Cold, calculated, ruthless. They did not attack in anger. They attacked because they knew they would win. Over 30 years they had destroyed or conquered 12 civilizations. Every time the same story happened. A world called for help, and the galaxy hesitated. When Draxen warships appeared at the edge of the Kelvora system, there was no warning, no communication, no demand, just ships. Hundreds of them, dark shapes sliding silently into sensor range like a storm forming in space. The report reached Sathrin late in the afternoon. A young defense officer delivered the tablet with trembling hands. Sathrin studied the numbers carefully. 341 Draxen warships, moving steadily toward Kelvora Prime. Estimated arrival, 31 hours. Sathrin didn't panic. Age had taken panic away from him long ago. Instead, he calmly opened the secure communication line to the Sovereignty Council. The connection took several minutes. Finally, an artificial voice answered. "Council members are currently in session. Please leave your message." Sathrin left the emergency report. Then he sent a priority distress signal, the kind meant to bypass normal bureaucracy. The reply came instantly. Transmission received. Response expected within 48 hours. Sathrin stared at the screen. 48 hours. The Draxen fleet would arrive in 31. He slowly closed his eyes. Then he stood up. If the council would not answer immediately, someone else might. Sathrin walked to the old communications tower in the center of the capital city. It was one of the oldest structures on the planet, built before Kelvora had even discovered faster-than-light travel. From the top floor, you could see almost the entire city. Curved buildings, wide green fields, rivers reflecting the amber sunlight like molten gold. Sathrin looked at it all for a long moment. Then he turned to the communications team. "Prepare a broadcast," he said quietly. "Not just to the sovereignty, to everyone." The technicians worked through the night. Every frequency, every direction, every civilization they had records for. Empires, federations, trade unions, scientific colonies. The message itself was simple. Kelvora Prime is under attack. We are peaceful. We need help. The signal was sent just before dawn, and then they waited. Across the galaxy, powerful governments received the message. Some sent polite acknowledgments. Some sent diplomatic sympathy. Most sent nothing at all. But in a quiet relay station far away, someone noticed something unusual. A small confirmation ping. A response. It came from a direction no one expected, and the timestamp showed something impossible. The reply had arrived in 4 minutes and 17 seconds, which meant only one thing. Whoever received the signal had already started moving, and they were coming fast. But no one on Kelvora knew that yet, not even Elder Sathrin, because far beyond their system, at the edge of a young civilization's territory, an alarm had just reached Earth. And on that planet, there were people who had never learned how to ignore a call for help. At 3:40 in the morning on Earth, a tired duty officer walked into a briefing room with a single printed message. Within 10 minutes, the most powerful fleet humanity had ever built would begin to move, and once it started, nothing in the galaxy would ever see war the same way.
On Earth, the signal arrived at 0340 in the morning. Most of Geneva was asleep. The streets were empty, the lake was dark, and the city lights looked soft under the clouds. But inside the United Earth Defense Command, the lights were still on. They were always on. Trouble had never cared much about business hours. Admiral Serena Akari was in the middle of a late-night strategy review when the duty officer entered the room. He looked tired but alert in the way military officers learn to be. He carried a printed copy of the distress message. "Priority wideband signal, ma'am," he said. Akari took the paper without a word. She was a tall woman with short, dark hair touched with silver at the edges. Her face was calm, almost too calm, but the people who served under her knew better. When Admiral Akari went quiet, it usually meant her mind was moving faster than everyone else's. She read the signal once, then again. Her eyes stopped at the line that listed the size of the attacking fleet. 341 Virek warships, then the arrival estimate, then the phrase, "We are peaceful, we need help." Akari lowered the paper and looked at the duty officer. Who else received this? "Most of the major powers," he replied. "It was a full-spectrum distress call." "Responses?" The officer hesitated for half a second. "The sovereignty logged it for review. A few member states sent formal sympathy. No active fleet movement reported." The room fell silent. One of the senior officers at the table folded his arms. "Kelvora is not under Earth protection status," he said carefully. "We have no treaty obligation." Akari looked at him. "No," she said, "we have something older than that." A few people in the room understood immediately. Others did not, but no one interrupted her. She turned to the operations screen and spoke clearly. "Wake Fleet Command." The duty officer straightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Open emergency mobilization channel." "Yes, ma'am." "Alert all active strike groups within response range." The room changed in seconds. Silence became motion. Screens lit up. Officers stood. Orders moved from station to station. Secure channels opened. Strategic maps began filling with ship markers. The officer who had mentioned treaty spoke again, more softly this time. "Admiral, are we committing fully?" Akari placed the distress message on the table. "Yes," she said. "If we go hard." Across Earth and its nearby colonies, commanders were pulled from sleep, meals, training exercises, and unfinished paperwork. On Luna Station, battle crews were called to launch decks. Over Mars, destroyers in repair orbit were ordered into accelerated readiness. At Titan, carrier groups received coded deployment sequences. In the outer defense yards, refit teams dropped their tools and cleared dry dock lanes. The message spread quickly, not just as an order, as a story. Kelvora, a peaceful world, surrounded, ignored, calling into the dark while everyone debated protocol, and Earth, once again, hearing a voice the rest of the galaxy had decided not to answer. On the flagship UES Resolute Dawn, Commander Darius Vale was running a tactical simulation when the deployment notice appeared across his screen. He read it once and ended the exercise immediately. "That's enough," he told his team. "This one's real." Nobody complained. Nobody asked for details. They had seen that look before. In the medical wing of another warship, Dr. Mina Sato closed her tablet and stood up before the page had even finished loading. If a full mobilization order had gone out at that hour, it meant lives were already hanging in the balance. And in the engine core of the supercarrier UES Atlas Crown, Chief Engineer Bram Orson looked at the order, nodded once, and called his crew. "Wake everyone," he said. "We leave at full burn." Within 3 hours, the first ships were already moving. Within 6, the dark around Earth was filling with warships. Not a parade, not a show of force, a decision, a promise made visible in steel, fire, and momentum. Far away, Kelvora still believed it had been abandoned, but on Earth, hundreds of ships were turning toward that distant world. And at the center of them all, Admiral Akari stood on the command deck, watching the fleet gather like a storm with purpose. Because humanity had heard the signal, and humanity had decided to answer. As the fleet assembled, old records were pulled from Earth's archives, records of a forgotten kindness from Kelvora, buried nearly a century in the past. And when the crews learned why their admiral had answered so fast, the mission became personal. By the time the fleet was fully mobilizing, thousands of people across Earth's defense network had already seen the Kelvora distress signal. But Admiral Serena Akari was looking at something else, an old file. It had been pulled from deep inside the United Earth Historical Archives, buried in medical records from almost a century earlier. The file was labeled Vandral Pandemic, year 2291. Most people alive today barely remembered the event. It had happened generations ago, before humanity truly spread among the stars. But at the time, it had nearly destroyed them. The disease had started on an outer colony station. At first, it seemed like a small outbreak, unfortunate but manageable. Then it spread, fast. Within months, it reached Mars. Within another few months, it reached Earth itself. Hospitals filled faster than doctors could treat patients. Entire cities shut down as governments tried to slow the infection. Scientists worked day and night, but the virus kept changing, evolving faster than treatments could keep up. The numbers became terrifying. Some projections predicted that 1/3 of humanity might die within 2 years. Earth asked the Galactic sovereignty for help. They received sympathy. They received diplomatic messages. They received carefully worded concern, but no one sent anything useful. Then one morning, without warning, a transmission arrived. It was not a message. It was a research package. Thousands of pages of biological analysis, immune response data, and pathogen modeling far beyond anything Earth scientists had produced yet. The data came from one place, Kelvora Prime. No introduction, no explanation, just the research. At first, Earth scientists didn't even understand why Kelvori researchers had been studying something so similar to the Vandral virus. But as they read through the files, the answer became clear. The Kelvori had simply noticed the outbreak through long-range medical monitoring networks. They saw a pattern, and they decided to help. Their work allowed human scientists to build the first effective treatment within months. The pandemic didn't disappear overnight, but the death rate dropped sharply. By the end of the first year, 70,000 lives had already been saved. Eventually, the cure spread to every colony. Humanity survived. But there had been consequences. Kelvora had acted outside sovereignty protocol when they sent that research. Helping another civilization without approval from the Council was considered interference. Trade agreements with Kelvora were quietly reduced. Their political influence in the sovereignty weakened. None of that stopped them, and the Kelvori never mentioned what they had done, not once.
They never demanded repayment, never asked for recognition, never reminded humanity of the help they had given. Most of the galaxy forgot, but Earth didn't. For decades, the story had been quietly taught inside the Defense Command academies, not as a lesson in politics, but as a lesson in memory. When someone saves you without asking for anything in return, you remember. And when that same world calls for help one day, you answer. Now, nearly a century later, the signal from Kelvora had arrived, and Admiral Akari had recognized the name immediately. That was why the fleet was moving. Across the solar system, 487 ships were assembling. Carriers, dreadnoughts, destroyers, rapid response gunships, medical vessels, support ships, every kind of vessel humanity had built for war. Not for conquest, for protection. One by one, they slipped into formation around the flagship UES Atlas Crown. To outside observers, it would have looked strange. A young civilization, barely 80 years into deep space travel, mobilizing its entire military force for a distant world that wasn't even part of its territory. But inside those ships, the crews understood. They knew the story. Many of them had grown up hearing it. Kelvora helped us. Now Kelvora needs help. That was enough. On the command bridge of the Atlas Crown, Admiral Akari watched the final readiness reports arrive. "Fleet status?" she asked. The navigation officer glanced at the main screen. "All task groups assembled, Admiral." "Drive readiness?" "Green across the board." Akari looked out at the star field displayed across the bridge viewport. Far away, beyond dozens of star systems, a peaceful world was waiting and losing time. She leaned forward slightly. "Prepare jump coordinates." Around her, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. No speeches, no celebrations, just work. Because they all knew what came next. The fleet would disappear into jump space, and when they arrived in Kelvora system, they would be outnumbered. As the 487-ship fleet entered jump space, no one in the galaxy noticed, except one Vyrek sensor officer, and what he saw forming at the edge of the Kelvora system made him call his commander with a single quiet sentence. "General, something very large just arrived."
On Kelvora Prime, the final hours before the invasion felt strangely quiet. The capital city had gone almost completely dark, not because power had failed, but because people had already moved into the underground shelters. Streets that once held evening markets and quiet river walks were now empty. The world was holding its breath. Above the planet, the Vyrek Dominion fleet moved slowly into position. Their ships were enormous, dark armored vessels built for siege warfare. They formed a heavy arc in orbit, like a steel wall slowly tightening around the planet. On the bridge of the Vyrek flagship Iron Sovereign, General Varak Threx watched the planet below with calm satisfaction. He was a large being, broad and powerful, his dark armored skin shaped by the high-gravity world his species came from. His career had spanned more than 2 decades, and during that time he had commanded the conquest of 6 civilizations personally. He understood the rhythm of these campaigns. First came resistance, then desperation, then surrender. Kelvora had already reached the desperation stage. Their distress signal had been detected hours earlier. The Vyrek had intercepted it and watched the responses carefully. Diplomatic sympathy, formal acknowledgments, political discussions, but no fleets. Varak had seen this before. Civilizations always believed someone would save them. Someone stronger, someone brave enough to challenge the Vyrek Dominion. But no one ever came. He turned slightly toward his communications officer. "Prepare the bombardment sequence," he said. "Yes, General. Target the northern defense grid first." Below them, Kelvora Prime glowed softly in the amber light of its star. Green continents, wide rivers, peaceful cities. Soon it would look very different. The general clasped his hands behind his back. He had already moved on to the next stage of the operation. Then a voice interrupted the quiet bridge. "General, long-range sensors are detecting something." Varrock frowned slightly. "Define something." The sensor officer hesitated. At first, it appeared to be a fluctuation, but the readings are stabilizing. Varrock walked across the bridge toward the sensor station. "Show me." The display expanded across the main screen. A small cluster of signals appeared at the edge of the system. 5 ships, then 10, then 20. The numbers continued climbing. The sensor computer began grouping the signals automatically as more appeared. Varrock watched silently. The count passed 100, then 200, then 300. The bridge grew very quiet. "General," the officer said carefully, 487 vessels detected." Varrock stared at the screen. The ships were not forming a defensive line around Kelvora. They were arranging themselves in something else, a formation he had never seen before. It wasn't built to protect something. It was built to hunt. "Identification?" Varrock asked. The communications officer ran the scan. The system processed the data for several seconds. Then the answer appeared. "Leading vessel, UES Atlas Crown." She paused. "Origin, Earth." Varrock said the name slowly. Earth. He knew it vaguely. A young species, recently active in interstellar space. Minor influence, limited territory. Certainly not a military power capable of challenging the Virek Dominion. Yet the formation filling his screen told a different story. Varrock opened a direct communications channel. His voice echoed calmly through space. "Unknown fleet, you are entering a Virek Dominion military zone. Identify your purpose and withdraw immediately." There was a pause. Then a voice answered, clear, calm, completely without fear. "This is Admiral Serena Akari of the United Earth Defense Command." Another pause. "We received a distress signal." Varrock frowned. The woman continued. "You are currently surrounding a civilian world." Her voice did not change. "You have 20 minutes to begin withdrawing your forces." The bridge of the Iron Sovereign went completely silent. Then she finished. "After that, we will remove you." Varrock stared at the screen. 20 minutes. He had commanded fleets for 22 years. He had never once been given a warning like that. He looked again at the formation of 487 Earth warships, moving slowly into position around his fleet. Something about the way they were positioned bothered him. It didn't match any known tactical doctrine. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't aggressive. It was something unfamiliar. He did not like unfamiliar. "Hold position," he ordered quietly. The bombardment command stopped. The fleet remained in orbit. Across the system, the Earth ships waited. On the bridge of the Atlas Crown, Admiral Akari sat calmly in the command chair. Commander Vale watched the tactical display. "They're not moving," he said. "I know," Akari replied. "They think we're bluffing." The timer of the screen reached 20 minutes. Then one more. Akari leaned forward slightly. "All fleet units," she said, "execute pattern 7." And in that moment, the Earth fleet exploded into motion. Instead of attacking directly, the human fleet did something no Virek commander had ever seen before. They split into 11 separate strike groups, and within minutes, the most feared fleet in the galaxy realized something terrifying. They were no longer the hunters. They were the ones being hunted. When Admiral Akari gave the order, the Earth fleet did not charge forward. That was the first thing that confused the Virek commanders. For centuries, space battles had followed a familiar pattern. Two fleets met head-on. They formed defensive walls, pushed forward with firepower,
and tried to overwhelm each other with strength. Mass against mass, power against power. But the human fleet did none of that. Instead, the 487 ships suddenly split apart, not into two groups, not even three, into 11 separate formations, each moving in a different direction at the exact same moment. To the Vyrek sensor officers, it looked almost chaotic at first. Ships accelerated outward like sparks from a fire, spreading across the orbital plane around Calvora Prime. 3 groups moved upward, climbing above the planet's orbital line. 2 groups dropped far below it. The others curved around the Vyrek formation from strange angles that no traditional fleet maneuver had ever used before. On the bridge of the Iron Sovereign, General Varak Threx leaned closer to the sensor display. "What are they doing?" one of his officers asked quietly. Varak did not answer, because he didn't know. The Earth ships were faster than expected. Their engines were built for rapid bursts of acceleration instead of sustained top speed. That design choice suddenly mattered. Within minutes, the 11 groups had spread far beyond the Vyrek fleet, surrounding them from directions their defenses had never been designed to cover. Vyrek reacted quickly. "Break formation," he ordered. "Divide the fleet. Intercept those strike groups." But the Vyrek ships were built differently. They were designed to operate as a single, overwhelming force, a massive armored fist that crushed enemies head-on. Splitting them into smaller maneuvering groups was slow and awkward, and the human fleet was already moving. The first attacks came from 3 directions at once. Bright lines of weapons fire streaked across the darkness of space. The Vyrek shields flared as the blast struck their outer defenses. Normally, those shields could absorb tremendous punishment, but the human ships were not firing randomly. They were targeting very specific points: small structural seams in the Vyrek armor, tiny gaps in shield overlap, areas that most fleets would never notice. But human scanners had already mapped the enemy ships in incredible detail, and human tacticians had spent the last 20 minutes studying those weaknesses. The results were immediate. One Vyrek cruiser lost its shield grid in seconds. Another ship's propulsion system exploded under concentrated fire. A third vessel spun helplessly as its weapon arrays went dark. On Calvora Prime, Elder Sathrin stood in the communications tower, watching the battle unfold through the defense network's orbital sensors. The display wasn't perfect, but it showed the shapes of the fleets above the planet, the large cluster of Vyrek ships, and the smaller, faster Earth vessels moving around them like water flowing around stone. Beside him stood the young soldier assigned to assist him. Her name was Teva, and she was barely 20. Her amber eyes were wide as she watched the battle. "Who are they?" she asked softly. Sathrin studied the screen. He watched one Earth destroyer perform a sudden turn that exposed the weak flank of a Vyrek warship. A second human vessel struck the opening instantly. The Vyrek ship went dark. Sathrin answered quietly, "The ones we helped." Teva looked at him. Then she looked back at the battle. "They came," she whispered. It wasn't really a question. Sathrin nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "they did." But far above the planet, the battle was only beginning, because the Vyrek Dominion was not helpless. Their ships were massive, their weapons were powerful, and when one of the Earth strike groups moved too close to the heart of the Vyrek formation, the Dominion fleet finally struck back. The first human ship exploded 32 minutes into the battle. And in that moment, the Vyrek commander realized something terrifying. The humans weren't fighting to survive. They were fighting to win.
32 minutes into the battle, the first human ship was destroyed. It happened fast. A Vyrek heavy cruiser managed to trap one of the Earth destroyers in a direct weapons exchange. Unlike the fast maneuver fights happening across most of the battlefield, this moment became exactly the kind of fight the Vyrek preferred. Direct, brutal. The cruiser's main cannon fired once. A brilliant white beam crossed the darkness and struck the destroyer UES Pathfinder directly along its midsection. For a moment, the ship held together. Then the hull split apart. A silent explosion of light and debris scattered across the void. On the bridge of the Atlas Crown, Commander Vale watched the tactical screen carefully. "Pathfinder is gone," he said quietly. Admiral Akari nodded once. No dramatic reaction, no shouting, just a small pause. Because every person on that bridge understood something important. Loss was always part of war, but that loss did not change the mission. Around the battlefield, the other Earth ships adjusted their formations instantly. The group Pathfinder had been part of shifted slightly left, tightening their maneuver pattern to close the gap. No panic, just movement, because that was the difference between a trained fleet and a frightened one. Meanwhile, the Vyrek fleet pushed back. Several of their larger ships began focusing heavy fire on the closest Earth formations. Their weapons were devastating when they connected directly. Another human ship, the UES Meridian, took a powerful hit across its engine array. "Meridian losing thrust," Vale reported. The ship fell out of formation, drifting slightly as its engines struggled. Two nearby frigates immediately moved to shield it. They positioned themselves between the damaged vessel and the Vyrek fleet, absorbing incoming fire, while Meridian's crew fought to stabilize their systems. Across the fleet channels, calm voices filled the communication network. Damage reports, position adjustments, requests for cover. No one shouted, no one panicked. It sounded more like engineers solving a problem than soldiers fighting for their lives. Down in the Atlas Crown's engine core, Chief Engineer Bram Orson was dealing with a problem of his own. A shock wave from a nearby weapons strike had rattled the ship's secondary power grid. Two relay units had developed stress fractures. Normally, that would be a minor issue, but in the middle of a battle, even small problems could grow into disasters. If those relays failed completely, the ship's maneuvering thrusters would lose nearly 30% of their output. 30% less maneuverability meant 30% slower reactions, and in a fight like this, slow reactions got ships destroyed. Orson called 3 engineers to assist him. The engine room shook occasionally as distant weapons impacts rattled the hull, but his hands moved steadily, carefully, replacing the relay components one piece at a time. When he finished, he ran a quick diagnostic. All systems returned to green. He tapped his communicator. "Engine system stable," he reported. Up on the bridge, Akari simply nodded. Meanwhile, Commander Vale continued directing the fleet's movements across the tactical grid. The 11 strike groups were still circling the Vyrek fleet, slowly compressing their formation. But now the Dominion ships were adapting. They were learning. Some of the Vyrek captains began trying to break out of the human maneuver pattern. Vale adjusted immediately. "Group 7, pull left. Group 3, widen your arc. Group 9, close the southern corridor." Across the system, ships moved like pieces on a giant chessboard. Each maneuver small, but together they formed a larger shape, slowly, patiently. And after nearly 3 hours of fighting, something remarkable happened. For the first time in its 30-year campaign of conquest, the Vyrek Dominion fleet was no longer advancing. It was being pushed backward. And General Varek Threx was beginning to understand something he had never experienced before. His fleet wasn't winning. It was being controlled. 3 hours into the battle, the human fleet completed a maneuver no Vyrek commander had ever seen before. Suddenly, every escape path disappeared, and General Varek realized the truth. His entire fleet had just been trapped.
3 hours into the battle, General Varek Threx finally saw it.
For most of the fight, the battlefield had looked chaotic. Ships moving in every direction, weapons flashing across space, small groups constantly changing positions. At first glance, it had seemed like the humans were simply faster and more flexible. But now Varric understood the truth. It had never been chaos. It had been control. On the main tactical screen aboard the Iron Sovereign, the positions of every ship in the system were displayed in glowing lines and symbols. Varric stared at the map, and slowly the shape became clear. For 3 hours, the human fleet had been guiding his ships, pushing them, redirecting them, forcing them to react to constant pressure from different angles. Each maneuver the humans made had looked like a response, but it had actually been preparation. Now the pattern was complete. The Varric fleet was surrounded, not loosely, not partially, completely. Every direction Varric looked on the tactical display showed the same thing. Earth warships holding position at precise distances, forming a massive sphere around the Dominion fleet. Above, below, ahead, behind, every escape path was blocked. Varric's flagship had taken damage during the fight. Several other ships had been forced out of combat already, drifting away with crippled systems. But the remaining 300 Varric warships were still operational, and all of them were now trapped inside the human formation. On the bridge, one of his officers spoke quietly. "General, they've enclosed the entire fleet." Varric said nothing for a moment. He was not a foolish commander. He had conquered 6 civilizations because he knew how to evaluate situations honestly, and the honest truth was now staring him in the face. For 3 hours, the humans had not been trying to destroy his fleet. They had been herding it, step by step, like hunters guiding prey into a cage. He leaned forward slightly, studying the positions again. The human ships were still moving, tightening their formation slowly. Not rushing, not panicking, just closing the net. On the bridge of the Atlas Crown, Admiral Akari watched the tactical display from the opposite side of the battlefield. Commander Vale stood beside her. "The geometry is complete," he said. Akari nodded. The 11 strike groups had done exactly what they were designed to do. Each group had gradually pushed the Varric ships inward while sealing escape routes behind them. Now the Dominion fleet sat inside a giant 3-dimensional trap. Vale crossed his arms thoughtfully. "They didn't see it coming," he said. "They weren't supposed to," Akari replied. Below them, Kelvora Prime turned slowly in space, still untouched by the bombardment that had nearly begun hours earlier. The battle that had started as a desperate defense was becoming something very different, because now the humans held the advantage, and they knew it. Back on the Iron Sovereign, General Varric finally spoke. "Damage report." His officers quickly responded. 41 ships disabled or destroyed. Several cruisers heavily damaged. Shield reserves dropping across multiple vessels. Varric looked again at the human formation surrounding them. The ships were still closing in, not aggressively, deliberately. The message was clear. They could finish this, if they wanted to. Varric exhaled slowly. He had spent his entire career studying war. He understood something many commanders did not. Victory was not about pride. It was about survival. He activated the fleet-wide communication channel. "All Varric vessels," he said quietly. There was a pause across the network. "Prepare for withdrawal." Several officers on the bridge looked at him in surprise. Varric did not look back at them. He simply kept watching the tactical display, because he knew something they were only just beginning to realize. The humans had not just won this battle. They had changed the rules of war. As the Varric fleet began retreating from the Kelvora system, the people on the planet below watched the impossible happen. For the first time in 30 years, the Dominion was running away. On Kelvora Prime, people watched the impossible happen. At first, no one was sure what they were seeing. The emergency shelters were still full. Families stood close together under dim lights, listening to updates from public communication screens. Soldiers remained at defense stations. Medical teams stayed ready in case orbital bombardment began again. Everyone expected the next report to bring worse news. Instead, the sensor feed changed. The cluster of Vyrek ships above the planet, once pressing closer and closer, began to shift direction, not forward, away. At the communications tower, Elder Sathran stood beside Teva and several exhausted officers as the updated tactical display refreshed again and again. One of the officers leaned toward her console, hardly breathing. "They're breaking formation," she said. Another voice came from the defense network. "Confirmed. Dominion vessels are turning toward the outer system." Teva stared at the screen as if she was afraid it might vanish if she blinked. "They're leaving," she whispered. This time it really was a question. Sathran watched the movement of the ships for several long seconds. The Earth fleet did not chase recklessly. It held position in organized layers, watching the retreat, making sure it was real. Only then did he answer. "Yes," he said softly, "they're leaving." Across the city, the news spread faster than any official announcement could control. At first, it moved in quiet words. A shelter worker telling a frightened family. A defense officer whispering into a headset. A medic looking up from her station in disbelief. Then the truth became too large to keep quiet. The Vyrek Dominion, who had destroyed 12 civilizations and terrified half the sector, was withdrawing. For the first time in 30 years, they were not conquering a world, they were running from one. On the bridge of the Iron Sovereign, General Varek Threx stood with his hands behind his back and watched the tactical map update as his fleet moved toward the edge of the system. He hated retreat. Every instinct built over 22 years of command pushed against it. But instinct was not strategy, and stubbornness was not strength. He had already made the correct decision. The Earth fleet did not pursue beyond the outer combat boundary. That told him something important. Their goal had not been destruction for its own sake. Their goal had been Calvora. Protect the world, break the siege, end the threat. Mission complete. That kind of discipline troubled him almost as much as their tactics, because it meant this had not been luck, it had been doctrine. On the bridge of the Atlas Crown, Commander Vale studied the withdrawal pattern. 41 enemy ships disabled, remaining forces retreating on vector exit. Only then did Admiral Akari allow herself a small breath. Not relief, not yet, just release. The communications officer turned toward her. "Surface channel is open, Admiral." Akari nodded and stepped toward the console. Her voice, when it crossed the distance between orbit and planet, was calm and clear. "Calvora Prime, this is Admiral Serena Akari of the United Earth Defense Command." All across Calvora, people stopped to listen. "The Vyrek fleet has withdrawn from your system. Earth forces remain in orbit. We are holding position until your government confirms further needs." There was a pause. Then Elder Sathran's voice came back over the channel. Old, careful, full of something too deep for simple words. "Then I have one request," he said. Akari waited. "Tell our people," Sathran said, "that they may come home." For the first time since the signal had been sent, silence fell across the city, without fear inside it. Akari lowered her head for just a second. Then she answered. "Yes," she said, and her voice carried into every shelter, station, and darkened home on the planet. "Tell them it is safe now." That was the moment everything changed. Not when the first shots were fired, not when the Vyrek were trapped, not even when they turned away. It changed when an entire world heard the words it thought no one would ever say again. You survived. You are safe. You can come back into the light. The battle was over,
But the real answer came the next morning when a human diplomat sat across from Elder Sathrin, and he asked the question that haunted him all night. Why did Earth come for us?
The morning after the battle arrived quietly. A light gray rain fell across the capital city of Calvora Prime. The streets were wet, the air cool, and the sky heavy with clouds that moved slowly between the 4 distant moons. For the first time in 2 days, the city was alive again. Shelter doors opened carefully. Families stepped out into the streets with cautious eyes. Some people simply stood outside for several minutes, breathing the fresh air as if they had forgotten what it felt like. Others began working immediately. Soldiers inspected damaged structures. Medical teams checked on injured citizens. Repair crews walked along roads scarred by the early bombardment strikes. The city had been wounded, but it had survived. Elder Sathrin walked through the rain slowly, greeting people who bowed respectfully as he passed. His body felt heavy from exhaustion. He had barely slept since the Vyrek fleet first appeared, but there was still work to do. The Earth fleet had sent a request during the night. They wished to send a diplomatic representative to the surface. Sathrin had agreed immediately. The meeting was arranged in the old assembly chamber beside the communications tower, the same tower from which the distress signal had been sent. When the shuttle from orbit descended through the gray sky, several Calvori officials gathered quietly to watch. The human who stepped first was smaller than Sathrin expected. Dr. Mina Sato, the Earth Fleet's xeno-diplomatic officer, carried only a small tablet in her hands. Her movements were calm and precise, and her eyes moved quickly across the city as if she were studying every detail. Behind her stood 2 security officers and a translator technician. Nothing about them looked threatening, but the ships waiting in orbit reminded everyone that appearances could be misleading. Inside the assembly chamber, Sathrin greeted her with the formal Calvori bow. To his surprise, Sato returned the gesture almost perfectly. They sat across from one another at a low wooden table, while tea was brought in small amber cups. For a while, they discussed practical matters: medical assistance, structural repairs, communication support from Earth technicians. The Earth had already begun organizing supply shipments from their fleet. Everything was direct, efficient. But eventually, the practical discussion ended. A quiet moment settled between them. Sathrin wrapped his long fingers around the warm cup and studied the human diplomat carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I wish to ask something directly." Sato nodded. "Of course. Why did you come?" The room grew very still. Sathrin continued slowly. "We are a small civilization. We have no strategic value to Earth. The sovereignty did not approve your intervention. You lost ships and lives defending a world that offers you nothing in return." His golden eyes met hers. "I have searched for the logic in this decision," he said quietly, "and I cannot find it." Sato looked down at her tea for a moment. Then she set the cup aside. "In the year 2291, Earth faced a plague." Sathrin's eyes flickered slightly. "It nearly destroyed us. Our scientists were losing the race to find a cure." She tapped her tablet and turned the screen so he could see the old records. And then a research package arrived. Sathrin leaned forward slowly. The data source displayed clearly on the screen: Calvora Prime. "Our scientists had not requested help. You simply saw the problem and sent what you knew." She looked back up at him. "That research saved 70,000 human lives in the first year." Sathrin said nothing. "You were punished by the sovereignty for interfering. Trade access reduced, political standing weakened." Still, he said nothing. "We watched," Sato said. "For nearly a century, we watched what happened to the civilization that saved us." A long silence passed. Then she finished the thought simply. "And when you called for help, we answered." Sathrin stared at the screen for a long time. Finally, he spoke again. We never expected repayment. Sato nodded. That's why it mattered. Outside, the rain continued to fall gently across the city. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes the most powerful answers were the simplest ones. 3 days later, Admiral Akari was summoned before the Galactic Sovereignty Council. The leaders of the galaxy wanted to know one thing: why had Earth broken their rules? And Akari's answer would leave the entire council chamber silent.
3 days after the battle, Admiral Serena Akari received a message from the Galactic Sovereignty Council. It was not a request, it was a summons. The Council demanded an explanation for Earth's actions in the Kelvora system. According to sovereignty law, Earth had interfered in a declared military conflict without authorization. In other words, they had broken the rules. Akari attended the session through a long-range communication link from the bridge of the Atlas Crown. Her image appeared on the enormous central screen inside the Sovereignty Council chamber. The chamber itself was vast and circular, filled with representatives from dozens of civilizations. Tall, silver-skinned diplomats stood beside insectoid envoys. Massive armored beings sat behind glowing consoles. Others appeared through holographic projections from systems too far away to travel quickly. Nearly every major power had sent someone, which meant the issue had become serious. At the center of the chamber stood Ambassador Kael, the sovereignty's presiding officer. His voice was calm and smooth as he began the session. "Admiral Akari of Earth," he said, "your forces entered a declared Vyrek Dominion military zone without sovereignty authorization. You engaged a foreign fleet and altered the outcome of a conflict between recognized galactic powers." He paused. "Several council members believe this action sets a dangerous precedent." The chamber murmured quietly. Akari listened without interrupting. Kael continued. "The sovereignty exists to prevent unilateral military actions that destabilize the galaxy. Your intervention could be interpreted as reckless." Another pause. "You are invited to explain Earth's decision." Akari leaned slightly closer to the communication camera. "Thank you," she said calmly. Then she nodded to her communications officer. A document appeared across every screen in the council chamber. It was a simple list, 12 names. Each name belonged to a civilization that had once been part of the sovereignty. Beside each name were 2 columns of information. The first column showed the date their distress signal had been received. The second column showed the sovereignty's response: pending review, under evaluation, diplomatic concern issued, awaiting council discussion. The chamber grew very quiet. Those 12 civilizations no longer existed. They had been conquered by the Vyrek Dominion over the last 30 years. Akari allowed the silence to sit for nearly a full minute. Then she spoke again. "I am not here to accuse this council of cowardice," she said. "The sovereignty manages a complicated galaxy with many political pressures. Decisions here are not simple." Several council members shifted slightly, unsure where she was going. "But there is a pattern here," she continued. She gestured toward the list. 12 worlds called for help. Her voice remained calm. No fleets came. Another pause. When the 13th world called, she folded her hands calmly. Earth answered. The chamber remained silent. One of the representatives finally spoke. "You risked escalating a sector-wide war." Akari nodded slightly. "That risk existed." "Then why do it?" the envoy pressed. Akari's expression did not change. "Because someone asked." The words were simple,
but they landed heavily in the chamber. Another representative leaned forward. If every civilization behaved this way, the sovereignty would lose control of military actions across the galaxy. Akari looked directly into the camera. "With respect," she said quietly, "the sovereignty already lost control the moment 12 civilizations disappeared while their distress calls waited for approval." No one spoke. For several seconds, the entire chamber sat in silence. Finally, Ambassador Kael cleared his throat. "The Council will review this matter further," which in sovereignty language meant something very specific. No one had a strong enough argument to punish Earth. The session ended soon afterward. Back on the bridge of the Atlas Crown, Akari leaned back in her chair as the communication link closed. Commander Vale stepped beside her. "You think they'll try again?" he asked. Akari looked out at the quiet star field. "Probably," she said. Vale nodded. "And we'll answer the same way." Akari allowed herself a faint smile. Yes, because in the end, the Council's rules mattered, but something else mattered more, and everyone in that chamber had just been reminded of it. Weeks later, something unexpected began happening across the galaxy. Young recruits from several different worlds, including one from Kelvora itself, started applying to join Earth's Defense Command. Because the battle had changed more than one war, it had changed what people believed was possible.
In the weeks after the Battle of Kelvora, the galaxy did not transform overnight. Old powers did not suddenly become wise. The sovereignty did not admit it had failed. The Draxen Dominion did not disappear. But something had changed, quietly, deeply, and once it started, it spread farther than anyone expected. For the first time in years, border systems that had lived in fear of the Virek saw something new on their long-range maps. Stillness. No invasion fleets moving. No expanding battle lines. No fresh distress signals from collapsing worlds. The Dominion had not become harmless. It was still strong, still feared, still dangerous. But it had stopped. Some analysts said the Virek were rebuilding. Some believed they were planning something bigger. Others argued that the defeat over Kelvora had forced them to reconsider everything they believed about war. Maybe all of those ideas were true, but for the small civilizations living near Virek space, the reason mattered less than the result. For now, they were alive. That mattered enough. On Kelvora Prime, rebuilding had already begun. The damaged northern districts were filled with engineers, labor teams, and volunteers. Roads were being repaired, public gardens were being replanted, burned walls were being stripped and rebuilt stone by stone. The city was healing, not quickly, but honestly. And in the center of that healing, the Kelvorai built something unexpected. Not a fortress, not a military memorial, a monument. It stood beside the river in a public square where families could gather. The design was simple, a dark stone sphere to represent a world, a single carved line reaching toward it from the far edge of the monument, like a signal traveling through space, and at the end of that line, one clear symbol, an open hand. The inscription at the base was written in both Kelvorai and English. It said, "They did not know us. They came anyway." Elder Sathrin stood at the unveiling ceremony beneath the warm light of the amber sun. Hundreds of people had gathered. Some stood quietly, some held children, some looked at the monument as if they were still trying to understand how they had lived long enough to see it completed. Several Earth officers were present as well. Admiral Akari had returned briefly for the ceremony. Commander Vale stood beside her with his hands behind his back, quiet as always. Dr. Mina Sato stood closer to the front, near Kelvorai officials she now knew by name. When the covering cloth was pulled away and the monument was revealed, the crowd did not cheer. They simply stood in silence.
because some moments were too full for noise. Across the galaxy, images of that monument began spreading through public networks. Then came something no one had expected: applications. At first, there were only a few, quiet requests sent to Earth's defense offices asking about training, exchange programs, medical service, engineering support, and diplomatic internships. Then more followed. One came from a border colony doctor who had spent 10 years treating refugees from fallen systems. Another came from a transport pilot whose people had lost family in one of the 12 conquered worlds. And one application came from Kelvora itself. Teva, the young soldier who had stood beside Sathrin in the communications tower during the battle. She submitted her paperwork through an Earth training station 3 sectors away. Her message was short: "I want to learn how to stand where they stood." When Sathrin read the confirmation notice days later, he sat quietly with it for a long time, not because he was surprised, but because he understood what it meant. The battle above Kelvora had not only saved a planet, it had given people something older civilizations had slowly forgotten: an example. Proof that power did not need to wait for permission to be decent. Proof that courage was not just attacking. Sometimes courage was arriving. And across the stars, more people were beginning to believe that now. 1 year later, another distress signal rose from a distant, unknown system. This time, the people sending it had never heard of Earth, but somewhere in deep space, 487 drives were already preparing to ignite again, and the story of Kelvora was about to become something even bigger. Not one rescue, but a promise.
1 year after the Battle of Kelvora, the galaxy had settled back into its usual rhythm. The sovereignty still met in its enormous council chamber. Diplomats still debated rules and treaties. Empires still weighed their interests carefully before making decisions. From the outside, it looked like nothing had truly changed. But beneath the surface, small things were different. The Draxen Dominion had not launched another invasion. Their fleets remained inside their own territory, rebuilding damaged ships and studying the reports from the battle they had never expected to lose. For the first time in decades, several border civilizations slept without expecting warships to appear above their skies. And everywhere, the story of Kelvora spread quietly through the galaxy. Not through official channels, through people. Through traders, travelers, scientists, and soldiers who repeated the same simple truth. A world had asked for help. Everyone hesitated, but Earth came. On Kelvora Prime, the monument by the river had become a place people visited often. Families walked past it during evening strolls. Children touched the stone sphere with curious hands. Travelers stopped to read the inscription carved across the base. They did not know us. They came anyway. Elder Sathrin sometimes visited the monument in the evenings when the amber sunlight reflected across the river. He liked the quiet there. The world had healed much faster than he expected. Buildings had been repaired, gardens replanted. The scars left by the bombardment were slowly disappearing. But one thing had remained: hope. Not the fragile hope that depended on powerful governments or distant alliances. A different kind. The hope that somewhere out in the dark between stars, someone might actually answer if you called. Sathrin understood something important now. The galaxy had not changed because Earth had won a battle. It had changed because Earth had shown up. And sometimes that was enough to start everything else. Far away, deep inside human space, the UES Atlas Crown had returned to routine patrol duty. Commander Vale was reviewing tactical training reports on the bridge. Dr. Mina Sato was preparing a cultural exchange file for 3 new alien recruits entering Earth's Academy program. And in the engine room, Chief Engineer Bram Orson was doing what he always did: fixing small problems before they became large ones. Admiral Serena Akari stood quietly near the front viewport, watching the stars. Space was calm tonight. almost too calm. Then the communications officer turned in his chair. "Admiral," he said, "we're receiving a wideband distress signal." Akari turned. "Origin?" The officer checked the coordinates. "Unknown civilization, outer sector. Rough translation indicates they are under attack." He hesitated slightly. "Estimated arrival time for enemy fleet, less than a day." Vale glanced up from his console. "Distance? 6 weeks at maximum jump speed." The bridge grew quiet. Akari stepped closer to the screen displaying the translated message. The signal was rough, badly formatted, clearly sent by a civilization that did not have advanced communication systems. But the meaning was easy to understand. Ships surrounding them, cities under threat. No allies, no help coming. Kari read the final line of the message. "If anyone can hear us, please." She stood there for a moment. Then she turned. "Plot the course." Vale smiled faintly. The navigation officer immediately began calculating jump vectors. Around the bridge, the night crew moved with calm efficiency. Not panic, not excitement, just readiness, because they had done this before. Within minutes, the order spread through the network fleet. Across nearby systems, human warships began turning toward new coordinates. Engines warmed, drive cores powered up, ships slipped into formation in the quiet darkness of space. 487 vessels. Again. On the Atlas crown, the jump corridor opened like a ripple in reality. Akari looked once more at the message from the unknown world. Those people had no idea who Earth was. They did not know about Kelvora. They did not know that somewhere far away, a civilization had once helped humanity without asking for anything in return. They only knew they were afraid, and they were calling into the dark. Akari gave the final command. "Take us in." The fleet accelerated. Stars stretched into bright lines as the ships entered the jump corridor. And somewhere, 6 weeks away, in a system whose name humans had never heard before, a frightened world waited for help that it believed would never come. They thought no one would answer, but they were wrong. Because long ago, humanity had made a decision so deep inside itself that it was no longer a rule or a strategy. It was simply part of what they were. When someone calls for help, you answer. Always. May this message strengthen your faith and renew your hope. Thank you for staying until the end. If this touched your heart, like, share, and subscribe to Astro Realms for more uplifting content. May God's blessings overflow in your life. See you soon.